Greetings to you all. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this panel, a global exchange on international law and Indigenous trade, Indigenous Peoples' Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement, or IPETCA. My name is Una Fitzgerald. I'm the president of the International Law Association of Canada, ILA-Canada, and Senior Fellow with the Human Rights Research and Education Center of the University of Ottawa. I'm an international lawyer and artist who makes performative, socially engaged art about international law. In keeping with Indigenous protocol and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada, it's my honor to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. And in saying that, I'd like to mention that we have people, Indigenous peoples from many other places in the world. And so you will hear acknowledgements from them as well as they are introduced throughout this panel. So we are meeting virtually across Canada and around the world. I would like to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples are the original occupiers, traditional stewards and inherent protectors of the lands and waters called Canada today. We are grateful to live on, learn from, and enjoy this land and commit ourselves to decolonization in our personal lives, our businesses, organizations, schools, and in our communities. The commitments we make in this land acknowledgement must be actively pursued and come with the belief that decolonization begins with reconciliation with all Indigenous peoples, inclusive of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. If reconciliation is to be successful, we must continue to deepen the ways in which we listen to, learn from, and support Indigenous peoples and their resilience, resistance, and self-determination. We remind non-Indigenous participants that it is our duty to learn about the territories we occupy and to work towards a relationship that fosters reconciliation between all nations. In this reminder, we would like to acknowledge the importance of seeking Indigenous voices in matters affecting these communities and to be also mindful of the multiple opinions, experiences, and needs which exist with each individual and collective. To Indigenous participants, supporters, and leadership, we thank you deeply for sharing your knowledge and experiences with us, and we look forward to working with you today and in the future. The International Law Association of Canada is the Canadian branch of the International Law Association, based in London, England, and founded in Brussels, Belgium in 1873. With over 4,500 members worldwide, our collective objective is to promote the study, clarification, and development of international law, both public and private, and the furtherance of international understanding and respect for international law. Comprised of legal scholars, legal practitioners, students, and policymakers, the ILA Global Network and its regional and national branches contribute to the work of ILA research committees on important topics of international law. They also hold biannual conferences, the next one being in Athens, Greece, this June, and organize panels and workshops on a wide range of international law topics, such as this one on Indigenous international trade. So ILA Canada is really pleased to partner with the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization and the University of Victoria to present this webinar. The IPETCA, or Indigenous Peoples' Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement, was negotiated 2 years ago, and all the member economies have officially endorsed its domestic implementation. As implementation of IPETCA commences, this panel is here to examine the challenges and opportunities for international Indigenous trade from perspectives of both IPETCA member economies and regional Indigenous communities. We have panelists today from Canada, the USA, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand, and they'll be discussing aspects of inclusive trade, types of economic activities, resource extraction, sustainable investment and development, cultural exchange, and environmental stewardship. We have 5 panelists. I'll just mention their names so you see them before you. Mr. Wayne Garnon Williams from Canada, Ms. Valerie Duvall from the US, Dr. Robert Joseph from New Zealand, Ms. Daphne Shi from Taiwan, and Mr. Damien Barnes from Australia. And finally, Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger, also from International Law Association of Canada, but currently living between Canada and Great Britain. It's my pleasure now to introduce Wayne, Wayne as the organizer of this panel. Wayne Garnon Williams is from the Moosomin First Nation and got his bachelor's degree in law from Queen's University, a master's of public administration from Dalhousie University, and his master of laws with a specialty in Indigenous international law from the University of Oklahoma College of Law. Wayne's Master of Law research thesis was on legal history, law, and policy of Indigenous trade between Canada and the United States. Wayne is a senior lawyer and principal director of the law firm Garwell Law Professional Corporation. Further, he leads an international business entitled Indigenous Sovereign Trade Consultancy Limited and is the founding president of the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization. He's a past board member of the he's a past board secretary of the Council of the Great Lakes Region, past chair of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations Appeal Tribunal, past chair of the National Council of Federal Aboriginal Employees, and is currently on the board of directors of the ILA-Canada. And we are very glad to have him with us. So I'm going to turn to you, Wayne, and we'll begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That's hello, Tanse, everyone. It's my wonderful honor to kind of do two things. One, to contextualize a little bit about IPETCA before we begin, and of course, then to introduce our moderator. First things first, one of the things that Canada did during the negotiations was the Canadian Indigenous team commissioned a wampum belt for IPETCA. And I have pre-done the ceremony with respect to the smudging and the appropriate protocols for this IPETCA belt, but I want to share it with you because I think it's important to contextualize the discussion here. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. Just let me do that. And then, okay, yeah, just a little bit about this. First of all, of course, IPETCA, the Indigenous Peoples Economic Trade and Cooperation Agreement, is the very first international cooperation arrangement in which Indigenous peoples and their respective nation states, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, negotiated a vehicle by which to conduct international Indigenous trade amongst endorsing economies. These negotiations and successful agreement invites other Indigenous nation state economies to also join IPETCA and to participate in the Indigenous international trade opportunities. And this IPETCA belt symbolizes this opportunity. So the Canadian Global Affairs Indigenous Working Group was very pleased to present this IPETCA wampum belt to the Crown and Right of Canada as part of the IPETCA endorsement ceremony. And this IPETCA wampum belt has both a connection to the past history of Indigenous to Indigenous trade, as well as trade with the Crown. Historically, shell beads of a wampum belt were used for ceremonial and artistic purposes by tribes on the east coast of North America, as well as tribes deep into the Great Lakes region of North America. Wampum belts were exchanged to mark and record a special occasion, such as an intertribal peace agreement or an intertribal trade agreement, or an arrangement between a First Nation and the Crown. And for example, the Haudenosaunee allocated the honor and responsibility of record keeping and wampum belt holding to the Onondaga, who are known as the wampum keepers. So the story behind the IPETCA belt, a little bit about what this means, because each wampum belt tells a story. The two figures that you see side by side represent Indigenous peoples and the nation state working collaboratively and closely together as partners, but not joined together. The blue background represents the water, the ocean that separates all the participating economies and their Indigenous peoples. The number of pairs are a lot more than the 4 founding economies of New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, and Canada, but the symbolism anticipates other economies with their Indigenous people joining IPETCA. The IPETCA wampum in its symbolism represents the promise of future prosperity in Indigenous international trade and partnership, not only with the Crown and other economies, but also with Indigenous nations from around the world. Commissioning the wampum belt by the Canadian Indigenous Trade Working Group was done to honor this event. So the wampum belt was made, if you just a little bit of credit to where credit is due, the actual wampum belt was made after listening to our stories of how we've negotiated and won this great agreement. The creator was Laurie Spirit Hawk, the clan mother of the Hawk clan of the Abenaki Nation of Vermont and New York State. And she also subcontracted the pine box. And the pine wampum box was created by Jack Stafford, a master woodcarver of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. So the Canadian Indigenous Working Group of IPETCA, the trade negotiators, they gifted the IPETCA wampum belt to the government of Canada, care of the Minister of Trade, Mary Ng, who's seen holding the wampum belt in Ottawa during the ceremony, entering it into force June 23rd, 2022. So I just wanted to share that with you so that we can contextualize and ground this work we're doing. So that being said, it's now my distinct honor to do the second phase of this, which is to introduce our moderator, Professor Mary Claire Courtney-Sager. A little bit about her academic background. She's got a PhD from Cambridge University, her doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oxford, her master's in environmental management from Yale University. She has a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Civil Law from McGill University, and her Bachelor of Honors, BA in Honors, from Carleton/University of Victoria. She's a Fellow in the Royal Society of Canada, a Fellow in the Royal Society of Arts of the United Kingdom, and Marie Claire is a world-leading scholar and jurist in the field of sustainable development law and governance. She is chair of the Sustainable Development Law and Policy and senior law fellow at the Lucy Cavendish College in the University of Cambridge, and serves as director of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law and as vice president of the International Law Association of Canada. She's also the adjunct professor of law at the University of Victoria and in the University of Waterloo. She has published, and I love this part, she's published over 24 books and 160 papers in 5 languages, including the new volume on UNDRIP, Indigenous Treaties and Sustainability, with yours truly. Mary Claire also edits several of the volumes on international treaty regimes concerning sustainable development for Cambridge University Press. And through the United Nations, assists highly climate vulnerable countries and international organizations in negotiation, implementation, and compliance with international law. So on top of that, she's just an amazing person, and we're really lucky to have her as our moderator. So Mary Claire, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks to you, and thanks also to the International Law Association of Canada, IITIO, and all the partners who are organizing this extraordinary event. I'm joining you from the grey stone spires and misty fenlands of Cambridgeshire in the United Kingdom, from which I acknowledge and respect my own ancestors through my grandfather, the Gwydir or Iceni peoples when we were escaping from the Romans, on whose ancient territories the University of Cambridge is found today. I must also recognize and honor the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional and unceded territory the University of Victoria stands, as a professor in the law faculty there, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasonic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now, it's my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the panelists tonight. Wayne, of course, needs no introduction, having already been introduced to you as the instigator of this event. But I'm very, very pleased that we are joined by several renowned experts from their different corners of the Pacific who are able to share with us their knowledge and experience tonight. Dr. Robert Joseph Maori is associate professor at Te Piringa Faculty of Law in the University of Waikato. He was admitted as a barrister and solicitor of the High Court of New Zealand in 1998 and completed his PhD in law on Maori and Indigenous governance at the University of Waikato in 2006. He was actually awarded several awards, including the Best PhD Thesis Internationally on Canadian Studies Award by the International Council of Canadian Studies. So he's no stranger to our country and to International Law Association of Canada. He's the current director of the Maori and Indigenous Governance Center at Waikato University and has been a trustee on numerous Maori trusts and organizations. He's also a current founding member of Te Taumata in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, dealing with Maori interests, the Treaty of Waitangi, and international free trade policy laws and agreements. Dr. Joseph is a former Claude McCarthy and Fulbright scholar, the latter at Harvard University. He's also an expert witness, licensed researcher and legal historian in the Waitangi Tribunal, the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization, and the International Indigenous Governance Consortium. So very warmest of welcomes, Dr. Joseph, and we're very, very glad that you're here with us. I'll introduce the other 4 panelists now, because I think that it's probably good for you to know all of them, and then we're going to go straight into a series of questions that we've prepared for them that we think our audience, whether they're joining us at, well, for me, it's midnight, coming on toward 1 o'clock in the morning. But for everybody, it's a different time. And many of you will be receiving this recording afterward. So Valerie Devil of Devil and Associates is also here with us tonight. She has practiced law for 20 years and is owner and managing partner of Devil and Associates, a full-service boutique law firm in Edmond, Oklahoma. Her fields of expertise include business and personal tax law, ex-state and tax planning, and resolving myriad state and federal tax controversies. She is an accomplished lawyer in tribal, municipal, and business development law for established as well as startup businesses. She's also a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, where she received a bachelor's degree in business administration, and also holds an MBA from the University of Missouri, where she earned a JD as well as an LLM in taxation. She frequently speaks on issues of taxation and government action, and is a vibrant contributor to internal revenue service and small business association rulemaking efforts affecting business regulations. And I'm very much looking forward to her insights tonight, especially into Indigenous-led business and some of the effects of international Indigenous trade and the opportunities thereof. We are also joined by Damien Barnes, who is the founder and managing director of YIMBA, YIMBA, providing legal, commercial management, and consulting services. He has an extensive background in law, commercial management, and engineering, providing advice on infrastructure, construction, transport, mining, energy, resources, renewables, environment planning, Indigenous business, land access, native title, land claims, cultural heritage, RAPs, ESG, and dispute resolution. His extensive professional experience includes King and Wood Milesons, DLA Piper, UGL, CB&I, O'Donnell, Griffin, Power Minerals, NTS Corp, and local and state government. And he holds an executive MBA, a law degree, a civil engineering degree, and a graduate certificate in Indigenous leadership. Now, his current board and committee roles are many, and he's asked us to only highlight a few so we don't embarrass him, but these include quite honorable and respectful engagements, including board member of SVC Victoria, chair of the Aboriginal Housing Office of New South Wales, and chair of Westpac's Indigenous Advisory Committee, also, of course, a member of the Partnership Council of the IPETCA, the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement. The YIMBA, which he owns and chairs, is 100% Indigenous owned, managed, and controlled by Damien, who is a proud Bijara man from Central QLG with family connection to Wurrabinda. Damien also provides extensive pro bono assistance to Indigenous communities and organizations in Australia. Now, I should also finally introduce Daphne Shi, who is arriving, of course, from the other side of the Pacific in a completely different time zone with us. She holds over 2 decades of diverse experience across academia, nonprofit, government, and corporate sectors. As former Director of Business Development and Partnerships at the Canadian Aboriginal and Minorities Council, she spearheaded initiatives to promote Indigenous trades in North America and Asia. She's passionate about environmental, social, and governance principles, which she integrates into her work to drive positive change. With roles in academia, including as adjunct lecturer at Minchuan University, and experience in governmental and nonprofit organizations, she possesses strong communication, leadership, and program management abilities, and her commitment to fostering innovation and driving impactful social change aligns with her passion for advancing ESG principles. So she's contributing. We're very, very grateful. Her extensive expertise in strategic partnerships and program management to many initiatives within the Indigenous community, and of course to us tonight as well. So we're truly joined by an extraordinary panel of experts from many different countries. Has worked on IPETCA from a Canadian Indigenous perspective, but also Robert, who has worked on it from the New Zealand Indigenous perspective, Daphne, who has worked on it from the Taiwanese Indigenous perspective, Damien, who has worked on IPETCA from the Australian Indigenous perspective, and Valerie, who of course holds such incredible knowledge and wealth of experience with business development from an American Indigenous perspective. I'm going to start just by asking a few questions and maybe putting a couple of our experts on the spot to answer them. And the first question in particular is about the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement, which Wayne has introduced so ceremonially at the beginning of this panel. And I'd like to also welcome all of you who are joining us online, and also those who are watching us afterward, having registered in order to receive the video and be able to watch it on your time zone when you're awake. And I'd like to especially ask if you have any questions, please just type them into the Q&A, and Una will help us to bring them forward and ensure they're asked. So our first question, which will go to Wayne and Damien, is from your various perspectives, what would you say are the origins of the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement, and how did your community get involved? If you can share a bit the history of the development of IPETCA and what you consider to be the key provisions, as well as why. So I'll turn maybe first to Wayne and then.
Certainly. Yes, I also think because my answers are going to probably steal the thunder from Rob. So sorry, Rob. Yeah, the origins of IPETCA go to the New Zealand government, because the New Zealand government back in 2021, in cooperation with the Maori trade organization Te Taumata, took the unique opportunity while New Zealand was the 2021 APEC host and chair to lead on the development of the first modern Indigenous-centered international trade negotiation. And they put the feelers out there, and 4 governments obviously came forward that were interested and ready and wanting to do this. New Zealand, Australia, Chinese Taipei, New Zealand was a host, of course. Australia, Chinese Taipei, and Canada collaborated with New Zealand. And the cool thing about this is that it wasn't like your father's trade negotiation agreement, because in the olden days, when trade would be negotiated, the nation states would have total control over their boundaries and their borders, and they would insist that they negotiated on behalf of everyone in Canada. And the cool thing about this one is the fact that Te Taumata took the lead and said, you know, this is an Indigenous to Indigenous trade agreement, which is supported by economies, supported by the various nation states. So let's do this collaboratively. And that's really unique. That's never happened before. And because of that, we had negotiations where we had a nation state government group, and we had an Indigenous group from that economy, jointly but separately negotiating. And the cool thing about that is the way that it would work is, of course, the nation state economies would lead with the discussion, but when they reached an impasse or when there was something a little wonky, they'd defer it to the Indigenous working groups, and we would come together and listen to one another. And the vast majority of time was listening and appreciating each other's stories, each other's perspective, and trying to find accommodation. And the cool thing about that accommodation was when the Indigenous groups found that accommodation and reached an accord, and they flipped it back to the nation state or economic government representatives, they were very loath to want to mess with that because, of course, this is a Indigenous to Indigenous trade arrangement. And if the representatives of Indigenous people had reached that agreement, then it's not for the nation states to interfere. So that's the really coolest thing about that. And I'm sorry, Rob, I stole your thunder.
I think Rob will have a great deal more to add. But worry not. But I'm going to turn to Damien and ask, from your perspective, what do you think are some of the key provisions of IPETCA? How did you get involved in it? What would you like to share for its origins?
Yeah, thank you, Marie-Claire, and thank you, Wayne, for that overview around the origins and the development and the original intentions. And so I should mention that. So I've recently been, as Marie-Claire pointed out in the introduction, I'm the Australian Indigenous co-representative as part of the Australian membership to IPETCA. I'm the co-representative with Leah Armstrong, a Torres Strait Islander woman, on behalf of Australia. In terms of the intentions, Wayne, you mentioned, it's great to hear those original intentions, because from my view, participating in IPETCA, I believe that is following through. The Australian government, all the various government departments who have input into IPETCA have been working with the Indigenous representatives, myself and Leah, on a cooperative joint basis. And as you would appreciate, working with government, there's a lot of different government departments that have input in relation to IPETCA. So it does take some time, just to liaise, consult, discuss, negotiate, get to a position of sort of joint consensus before reporting back to, Australia's position on IPETCA as well. But at this stage, it's working quite well in terms of that original intention, that it is kind of Indigenous-led discussions with the support, facilitation and backing of the Australian government. Mm-hmm. The other things maybe I'd point out too is there is a huge amount of work which is going on at the moment. We absolutely acknowledge all the good hard work which has been done to get us to the point where we are today, and also an acknowledgement to New Zealand for taking the lead on this and driving it and making it happen. I think one of the other key points I do greatly appreciate around IPETCA is its informal caucus that it has with APEC, and the formal face-to-face meetings which are held have kind of been on the back of the APEC meeting. So the first meeting I attended was in San Francisco, I believe in September, October last year. And it's great to have that informal caucus with APEC members who wish to attend, because obviously you can get a lot of traction, have a lot of positive, constructive conversations and dialogues with other member states as well. And then APEC members who are interested and are potentially considering joining, initially maybe on observership status. On that point, I should mention that the US government recently joined IPETCA as an observer. So we recently held a meeting last month in which the US attended on an observership status. So I think that was formally announced in April of this year. And we're very much keen to have the US obtain full membership status soon. So watch this space. In terms of the key provisions, I'll keep it very short. So just some of the main things that I see is, in the IPETCA arrangement is the acknowledgement of Indigenous rights, promotion of Indigenous economic empowerment, the cooperation activities between member states, and respect for the environment and traditional knowledge. The other key takeaway is that it's the it focuses on Indigenous business trade between participating members, but it also seeks to emphasise the ability for Indigenous businesses to trade with non-Indigenous members in international trade and investment as well. So I might just leave it at that. I'm just conscious of time. Back to you.
That's an
Claire.
excellent introduction. Thank you very, very much, Advocate Damien. And what I think is particularly helpful, of course, is that you give sort of almost between you and Wayne a picture of both the relationship of the treaty that Wayne spoke so eloquently about earlier in introducing the panel, as well as the way that it's actually working in practice. And of course, the important thing about a relationship, the important thing about an arrangement like this that serves as a structure and a framework to encourage in inter-Indigenous as well as Indigenous to other trade, is that it's there for business, it's there for sustainable economic development for the communities. And so I'm going to turn to Valerie and Daphne yet and ask if you could maybe answer, why is international Indigenous trade so important today? How does Indigenous trade fit with the inclusive economic and sustainable development agenda of your region, especially, of course, not just for you, Daphne, in Asia, but also Valerie at the local and state level, as well as nationally and internationally. So maybe I'll turn to Valerie first, if you wish, and then Daphne.
Thank you, Mary Claire. I would like to acknowledge that I am in the state of Oklahoma in the United States, and we do have 39 federally recognized tribes located in Oklahoma. It's a small area with a lot of tribes. I am sitting in the very historical jurisdiction of the Muskogee Creek Nation that Wayne referenced earlier with the Wampum Belt, and the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, of which I am Attorney General. And I appreciate that Damien addressed my elephant in the room, that the United States is not a member of IPETCA, but that we were granted observer status. And I would like to explain a little bit about, I guess I want to flip the question you asked and explain a little bit about how we do protect Indigenous rights and peoples in the United States. And I'll just kind of do a brief overview of that, if that's okay, and answering your question, and then get to the meat of it. All right. And
absolutely, there's economic rights involved in sustainable development too. So you're right on track.
okay. And I know I'm just gonna, in United States law, our Indigenous folks are called Indians as individuals and tribes. And I know that's offensive in some regions, but it's just how our law reads, and I can't change that. So, like I said, we do have 39 tribes here in Oklahoma. There are many more tribes in the United States. In the United States, tribes have the inherent right to govern themselves. It's more protected here in the United States because we do have treaties between the federal government and the tribes. We also have about 200 years of case law with the U.S. Supreme Court decisions, our highest court, and federal laws enacted by Congress. Here's an important distinction. In the continental United States, not including Alaska and Hawaii, our Indian tribes are land-based. That means they do have a geographic, physical jurisdiction of land to govern. And that's very important because many of our sovereign rights are attached to that land, and we exercise governmental authority and our sovereignty over that land. The reason we do have 39 tribes in the little state of Oklahoma is due to the removal era, the Andrew Jackson presidency. We all, don't love that guy, but it happened long ago, and there are 39 tribes here in the state of Oklahoma. We're talking about inclusivity, and I guess I'll talk a little bit about exclusivity as far as how the tribes operate in the state and trade with between themselves. I think we do really well. There is some tension and not inclusive behavior between the state of Oklahoma and the tribes located within our state. Our current governor is not very respectful to tribal nations, doesn't appreciate that there are 39 separate sovereigns within one state. If you've followed US law, we had a case in 2020. It was McGirt versus Oklahoma. I won't get into the details, but in our perspective, that was one of the good things that came out of 2020, the year of COVID. So in our state, at least the eastern 1/3 of our state is considered geographically still Indian reservation, and under the governance or the governance of some of the tribes that are located in that area. So it gets a little complicated, but the eastern side of our state is still considered Indian reservation in the state of Oklahoma. So since 2020, the tribal nations have become more inclusive, working and trading with each other. We call our current governor the Great Unifier, because, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So that's where we are now. We all work better, we get along better because we have a mutual enemy, and it is our current governor. Most of our tribal nations, I want to tell you a little bit about how we're governed. Like I talked about, we have treaties, we have federal law that protect Indian rights. Most of our tribal nations in Oklahoma have their own constitutions and codes of law. Most of us have our own court systems and our own police forces. And for the most part, our tribal nations support each other. This gets into a little bit of criminal law and not economic development, but we support each other's court systems, our laws, kind of a full faith and credit type thing. And what we have learned is when our Indian lands are safe and we have methods for dissolving disputes in our court systems, then trade flourishes, and that includes international trade. And so going back to the original question you asked about inclusive trade, as you all probably know, one of our biggest economic drivers in the state of Oklahoma is tourism, and the biggest part of that tourism trade is what we call Indian gaming, but that is not hunting and fishing, that is casinos. And we have many casinos. Oklahoma is a destination for tourism and casinos. As that market becomes more saturated, and it has, we have plenty of casinos here, Indian nations have evolved their economic development and expanded into such fields as like federal government contracting, which might be logistics or doing things for the federal government, and international trade. I do want to plug our one operating foreign trade zone in the state of Oklahoma that is located near me in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and is owned and operated by the Citizen Potawatomi Nation of Oklahoma. And it is, as I said, we are land-based, and it is on what we call trust or restricted land. And so it has many benefits that I'll talk about later. So I feel like we are engaged in international trade. We are inclusive, and I look forward to seeing how, you know, we can expand and do this with the other countries that are on this call.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Valerie. I'm going to turn straight to Daphne to give her perspective, please.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, according to Valerie, after listening to her, I believe, you know, the support from the government is very important, right? So although in Taiwan, there's only 2.5% of indigenous people in Taiwan, but the government is very supportive. You know, they try to, you know, they believe economic development can help indigenous people better preserve and promote their traditional society and the culture, enhance the quality of their life and maintain their dignity. Therefore, they invest significant resource in this area, especially indigenous trade. For example, specialized loan and entrepreneurship guidance for indigenous people have been provided. Okay, they bring positive impact. The numbers of indigenous business grew from 8,000 to 16,000 of just a few years, and it's doubling. So, and in addition, distribution channels for indigenous product and service have been established in 9 cities in Taiwan. And the e-commerce platform is built. So that's why I'm showing you. They have some stores. They build so, I don't know if you guys can see that. They build so many stores. I actually visit there, in Taiwan. So when you guys come to Taiwan, you can visit the stores physically. And there's a Lima store. And as I mentioned, they have an online store too. So the Lima online store allow tourists and to shop and to both online and physically. So this is, and then they can purchase the product globally as well, even they go back home. So this is something indigenous trade and also go international. So which is Taiwanese government is trying to do.
Oh, goodness me. Well, that certainly helps to underline not just some of the complexities with gaming and with logistics and other contracting and inter-indigenous trade, but also the opportunities in terms of opening up online stores as well as in-person stores and investing in indigenous business. Now, IPETCA in a way as a oh, awesome. IPETCA as an arrangement, as an Indigenous peoples economic trade and cooperation arrangement would sit as a framework to facilitate that type of activity. And I wonder, maybe turning back to Robert, who has been there right from the beginning and now has the ideal chance to steal some thunder back. Would you be willing to explain a little bit about why this arrangement is so important and for whom, and whether it even, signifies some kind of a new relationship between national governments and Indigenous peoples on economic cooperation and trade? And I'm going to ask Wayne afterward also to come in on this, but we'd love to hear from Dr. Joseph first. Please, the floor is yours.
A tēnā koutou katoa ngā rangatira o ngā hau e whākanui te mihi atu kia koutou. I bring you warm greetings from New Zealand. We're just starting our winter today, actually, so it's getting a bit cooler, but lovely to be with everyone. To that question about international law and IPETCA being important and new relationship, I just need to provide a bit of context for New Zealand, please, to answer it. And so quickly, so in New Zealand, we're considered a country down under, not Australia, but separate with respect, Stephen. And we're right next to Australia. We're an island state. Our population's just over 5 million right now. We were settled by the British. We're a colonial state like many others here, or all others here, from 1769 on. But within that process, today, Māori are the biggest, well, we're the indigenous people. We represent about 16% of the population. So we are the biggest minority here. And New Zealand being a British colonial state, we have a Westminster parliamentary system. And within our political system, about 15% of our politicians are Māori too. And Māori is an official language. Our customary law is now recognized within the legal system as a source of law. And currently I'm battling it out in the High Court over these very issues. And so I just wanted to mention that in 1840, when the British, I guess, officially colonized New Zealand, they did it by virtue of a treaty with the British Crown, under the authority of Queen Victoria. Our chiefs signed this treaty, including a lot of Māori women too, I might add, signed as chiefs. So it's not just the domain of the men, and they're the chiefs today too, by the way. And so we had this treaty we signed. 5 years earlier, we signed another treaty with the British, and it's what I call, it was our Declaration of Independence, 1834, and I refer to it as our first free trade agreement with a European nation. It was with the British. Maori were trading throughout the Pacific, even before the European contact. And so we had a history, quite a long history of trade, actually. I believe it even goes back up into North America from some of the traditional oral histories up there too. And so we had a lot of trade going on. But from that treaty, we had a constitutional partnership with the British Crown first and then the New Zealand government. And so when you talk about IPETCA today, yes, it was started in 2021, the idea with our government. But as part of this partnership here in New Zealand, treaty partnership, I'm a member of our taumata, which is our partnership Māori committee working in partnership with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade government department. And we started that in 2019 to reflect that partnership. And so even before IPETCA, and as a result of this taumata and some other Māori groups, this is how our government in recent years has worked to develop provisions and mechanisms to promote and advance Māori and Indigenous trade and economic participation and outcomes. Right? And so IPETCA was carrying on from that partnership, which we've already established. But we say in New Zealand, the partnership was already there. We just needed to remind our government of that partnership. And also add here too, as part of our taumata, we've actually been involved at the negotiating tables with our MFAT, Ministry of Foreign Affairs partners, for our free trade agreements with the European Union and the United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement. So during those negotiations, our taumata was representing Māori interests directly at the negotiating table. And as the adage says, if you're not at the negotiating table, the tables of power, you're on the menu. So you need to be at those tables of power. And that's what IPETCA is allowing Indigenous peoples to do, to sit at those tables of power, negotiate, represent our interests, our values, and so on and so forth. And so really this partnership is working for Māori. We have a number of others organizations too besides the taumata, but we're there to represent our interests, and IPETCA gave great expression to that partnership. So that answers that question.
That's an
Professor
excellent
Marie-Claire?
answer, and it helps to reconceive the relationship, as you say. I will turn to Wayne to see if you'd like to add anything. He's definitely stolen your thunder, though, Wayne.
I love it.
Not
I love
so,
it.
Wayne.
Steal away, my friend. Steal away. Yeah, the way I see what's really important with IPETCA is four things. One, definition. Second, environmental protections. Third, the Indigenous worldview incorporated with that reflects traditional knowledge and cultural heritage. And four, the 22 as a starter, 22 Indigenous trade and business topics, which I think is really cool. So starting off with basically Indigenous, the definition of Indigenous trade. For the very first time in international trade history, a global definition of what Indigenous trade is, has been defined within IPETCA. And that's exciting in the sense that when you look at the definition and you compare it between this and your grandfather's definition of trade, it is not. It is an Indigenous inspired definition. So for example, when we look at that definition, we see things that include the concept that trade and investment is a relational condition and aims to build long-term networks of exchange, or that its Indigenous laws and values, including reciprocity, care, trust, respect, and generosity, are in the definition. As well, another aspect of this is operating within an intergenerational framework. And finally, the responsibility of Indigenous peoples to protect their lands, resources, and spiritual interrelationship of the human and natural world, as well as the integrity of the natural ecosystems themselves. This is part of the definition of what Indigenous trade is all about. And this is one of the high standards that the world needs to look at if we want to survive for the next 2 generations because of the climate crisis that's out there. We need to incorporate traditional knowledge, traditional values that have as part of their DNA respect for the environment and the relationship with the environment, not command control over the environment, but belonging with the environment. So having that within the definition is vital. And of course, I do reference the environmental protections because it is so vital. And it's so vital because and because of that, the IPETCA lists specific environmental international agreements as part and parcel of IPETCA to remind everyone that's going to be taking part in this that these are touchstone documents that are reflections of traditional values of respect for the environment, giving back and not just taking. So we've got things like the Paris Agreement specifically referenced in the environmental protections, the Convention on Biological Diversity, another one, the Convention to Combat Desertification, another one, the UN financing and the development of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, another one. So all of these are specifically laid in there to remind us that this is part and parcel of trade. And of course, the next thing that I referenced was basically the worldview, Indigenous worldview, traditional knowledge and cultural heritage, all of this, again, because Indigenous people, as Rob said, were at the table. We were negotiating, we were leading the discussions, and we were giving it back to the nation state or economic, the economies, the government negotiators. We had a time where we would listen to each other and really listen about the philosophies, about what we value. And it's not just the trade in widgets. It's not just dollars and cents. It's about relationships with the land. It's about relationships with each other. And so that worldview of protecting heritage, protecting language, protecting land, protecting knowledge is all part and parcel of international trade. So, and finally, the fourth one, which is the meat and potatoes, and that's the 22 meat and potato business trade topics as just starters for discussions that can get the ball going for prioritizing what's really kind of on the menu and how we can get some low-hanging fruit going. Like, for example, things like access to government procurement, capital and markets and supply chains, or establishing Indigenous foreign trade zones, or promoting responsible business conduct, or certifying Indigenous-owned businesses and Indigenous-made goods, or cross-border trade processes, facilitating the tracing, authenticating, and protecting of Indigenous-owned production and Indigenous-made products. All these help establish that, build the infrastructure to help the movement of Indigenous trade and commerce and protect it at the same time. So these are the real things that I see that are the important aspects of IPETCA.
Excellent. Thank you, Wayne. And thanks also for not listing all 22, but giving us a real flavor and taste of what's in the arrangement, which is very more light on domestic implementation of international Indigenous trade, including IPETCA, and what it entails in your region. How is it going? What are the challenges and impact investment, whether it's in tax policy, benefit agreements, the role of capital or financial institutions? Damien, Valerie, would either of you like to get started on this? Oh, I can see that.
Could you just repeat the beginning of your question, because you cut out a little bit? Thank you very much.
Of course.
Maybe just
no trouble
summarize
at all.
it again. Thank you.
I'm just asking from Damien and Valerie, what does domestic implementation of international Indigenous trade, including under IPETCA, entail in your region, and how is it going? What are the challenges and opportunities for impact investment, including tax policy, benefit agreements, the role of capital and financial institutions in this process? Understanding that it's early days, and that for Valerie especially, of course, you're observers, and so you're going to be doing a lot from Oklahoma yourselves, with all 39 actors. Damien, asking you first.
Thank you. I should also apologise. In my rush to answer the first question, I didn't do a quick acknowledgement from Australia, so I'll just briefly get into it in my language. In Vidra, Europeans didn't come into our area until the 1870s. So, Nai Nakali Yinda, I acknowledge you. Yuringa Wadagan Wadaring Burul Nunti. your elders, spirits and country. Najunaya Damien Barnes. My name's Damien Barnes. Naya Peter Amadi, Bidra Man, Yambajina Peter Ananti, Wajamurubu. I belong Bidra country from Carnarvon Ranges. Najayumba, Bundi, Wurrung, Australia. I live in Bondi, Sydney. Naya Nakala Bidjigul, Gadigal, Warang, Australia. I acknowledge the Bidji and Gadi people of Sydney, Australia. Buna Wajigan Warang, Pururunonti, their elders, spirits and country. Naju Yurdi, Gordala. My flesh and clan is Eagle Hawk. So thank you, Marie-Claire, for the question. I might, in terms of the question, I might just kind of approach it in the reverse order, if that's okay. So I'll just initially address the challenges and opportunities in relation to impactful investment, including benefits, the role of capital and financial institutions. Then I'll talk about the domestic implementation in respect of IPETCA. So firstly, I'll say some of the challenges in relation to Indigenous businesses, particularly in Australia, is associated with firstly, there is a lot of commonality across our participating economies. The first one is the trust deficit. So, that causes that trust level when conducting business is kind of like the fundamental basis to be able to establish good business relationships and a thriving economy. So that's fundamental. Unfortunately, in Australia, that has been difficult to develop or slow to develop, essentially due to racial discrimination, stereotypes associated with Indigenous businesses. We're all quite familiar with the impacts associated with colonisation, and that has typically created significant roadblocks. One of the other serious issues is just access to capital. So, the banking framework, securitization, utilisation of collateral of Indigenous groups, it causes obstacles as well. Often the banks will approach it in a very kind of Western framework. They have difficulty assessing Indigenous groups, Indigenous businesses, through our lens and the values that we bring to the table as well. The other challenges we get is access to business networks. So, some of the significant businesses have a lot of contacts and connections across the country. Those networks, unfortunately, tend to be slow to develop and not as well established by the Indigenous groups in Australia. Also, some other challenges might be remote location as well. So some of these, particularly in relation to rural and remote communities, some of the ex-missions, which are now kind of cities and towns with a very high proportion of Indigenous people, don't necessarily have all the supporting business-related infrastructure to help them get off the ground and establish themselves. And in terms of, and look, on the other side, I think in terms of the opportunities, there has been some recognition by sort of state, territory, local, federal governments around those challenges. And so there has been opportunities provided by way of, the Indigenous procurement policies, which we're all generally familiar with. In Australia, it's the Indigenous procurement policy. There are various business development programs in place as well, and the offering of kind of more tailored financial products by the banking system. They still have a way to go, but there is at least an acknowledgement that they do have a way to go, and they are starting down that path, which is a good sign. There is some acknowledgement also, I think, on the tax side, that there is some work being done within Australia around tax and super related support for Indigenous businesses as well. And a lot of it is even just an awareness of Indigenous businesses, of the legislative framework and support which is there to enable them to actually access those opportunities. Now they're kind of opportunities, and I did highlight access to finance and capital was a major concern, and we are starting to see tailored Indigenous related financial institutions that support Indigenous businesses. And one of them is actually, it's called First Nations Capital. My co-representative on IPETCA, Leah Armstrong, is the chair of that organisation. And they provide support to Indigenous entrepreneurs. They assist them in getting to the stage of being investment ready. They support community building, partnerships, and impactful investment. And these are all very important things which are required to support intergenerational wealth creation as well. Now, something I'll also quickly touch on too is the current work that IPETCA is doing in relation to its work plan. So the participating member economies are presently working through their work plan, and they've identified 3 main pathways that they would like to kind of focus on. So the first one is, just give me a moment. The first one is trade, environment, and sustainability. The second pathway is evaluating Indigenous trade policy and practice. And the third pathway is connecting Indigenous business and entrepreneurs. And presently, each participating economy is identifying which of those 3 pathways it would like to lead in terms of that particular work stream. We've identified specific objectives in relation to each pathway, and the cascading effect will be we then have to roll out what activities need to fall out from that, and the outputs as well, and the expected timeframes for completion of those outputs as well. So look, conscious of time, I might stop there, and I'll hand it over to Valerie if you would like to comment further.
Valerie.
Thank you, Damien. It's just kind of amazing how much we have in common, even though we're so far apart. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about, actually, I'm sure I've heard what you refer to as the trust deficit. We have that here in the US too. I also heard you comment about the Western Framework access to capital. I'll talk about that. So I know that, here in the West, we kind of do things differently or have a way of doing things. But I think I want to discuss a little bit about how we address some of these issues here in the United States, because we do have some frameworks for handling this. So I want to talk about the way we set up our business structures to kind of address some of these issues here in the United States. So under our federal laws, we have 2 acts that were from the 1930s, the Indian Reorganization Act and the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. Because all the tribes in Oklahoma were scooted here kind of late and dumped all here together, we have specific laws for Oklahoma. It makes it fun and challenging to work here. But so we have those 2 federal acts that we can organize under. We can have a governmental arm and a business arm. And what we call that business arm of the tribe is a federal corporate charter. And under that federal corporate charter, like I was talking about earlier, we can have constitutions, codes of laws, and all these other things. So we set up codes of laws, and we can establish economic development authorities. And what this allows us to do is to separate the governmental part of our Indigenous nation from the business part. And some of the benefits of having this framework are that we can address some of the issues that Damien was talking about a minute ago. So if you have a business arm of your tribe that is separate from the governmental side, that business arm is not as influenced or subject to the tribal politics that go on. And so when you have this government arm, and you can do some of the things that we need to do to access capital, you can limit liability and limit risk. You can pledge collateral, which is always important to the banks. And by doing that only on the economic side, the corporate side, you aren't subjecting the governmental assets and programs to all the risk and liability of doing business. And so when you separate those things out, and have all of the pledgeable assets, all of the things that banks might look at, that financial institutions want, and you don't have as much political risk over in the corporate charter side, it makes it a little bit easier to do business. And so it gives our business partners some, I guess, confidence that they're not going to be, that our business transactions are not going to be kicked out or undone the next time there's a tribal election, and the leaders change, because the business partners, want more certainty and clarity on that. So when the business is separate from the governmental side, it provides this means to attract capital from banks. And I guess I'm gonna have to get back. So like I said, our tribe, our indigenous nations are land-based, and that land is usually held in trust by our federal government for the benefit of our tribal nations. And so we can't usually pledge that kind of land for collateral, but there are many things that we can pledge. And as I was talking about earlier, casino revenue is a big thing. So we can pledge revenue streams and things like that. So while we do have limited access to capital sometimes with our tribal nations, we do have some things that we can pledge. And because, I'll get into it later probably, but because our corporate charter sides are set up more like businesses, I want to talk a tiny bit about tax policy. And I don't want everybody to go to sleep, because tax is powerful and amazing. And I feel like the entire world is tax driven, either tax or liability driven. We want to control our tax burden. We want to, pay our fair share, but limit what that is. And so here in the United States, Indian tribes themselves, the indigenous nations, are exempt from almost all state and some federal taxes. So whether that might be sales tax, or that's a state tax here, or property tax, that's also a local tax. And there's some federal taxes we're exempt from anyway. So if you were going to do business in the state of Oklahoma with an Indian tribe, an Indian tribal business, and you wanted to locate here, and say you wanted to go to the Citizen Potawatomi Nation Foreign Trade Zone, which is located on trust land, that under our federal laws, which as I was talking about earlier, we are not subject to state laws unless the federal treaties or laws say we are subject to. So we're not subject to state taxes. But if you located your business here in the United States, in Oklahoma, on the Citizen Potawatomi Foreign Trade Zone, which is located on trust land, you would be exempt from the state property tax, which is a tax we have on, just owning property. You would be exempt from our sales tax. So you could buy the materials to build your factory exempt from sales tax. And that may be up to like a 10% savings. And these savings go on, And in addition to having these exemptions from tax, if there are any benefits that are federal or state benefits, like say you could get tax credits for employing people in rural areas, you still get the benefits, but you don't have the burdens. And so while I realize that the United States is not perfect in many, many ways, as our federal politics, presidencies, and indictments have shown lately, we do have some pretty cool things going on in what we call Indian country. So if anybody really wants to talk about tax, that's my favorite subject, and I'm happy to talk or correspond with anybody, but I won't go much more into that. But again, we have the exemptions and we still get the benefits of credits and things that have to do with tax. So tax policy is cool. And because we have these structures we can use that insulate from politics, I think it gives our banks and lending institutions a little more confidence that they can take collateral and that Indian tribes and tribal businesses will repay their loans.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Valerie. And I think you've infected us all a little by your own fascination for tax, which I would have said is a tough sell normally. for
Well,
so incredible.
I watched Wayne, Wayne, I watched him for a decade. He can get so excited about everything. He was the one that started.
I think it's perfectly fair. And it does sound like, while things may be crazy in some aspects, Oklahoma itself has a lot to offer, and we'll come back to that in just a second, because of course what we want to look at is some of these really key elements of the treaties that came up earlier, and do a slightly deeper dive. And in particular, I have a question for Daphne and Damien and Valerie, and it has to do with how international Indigenous trade, including under the IPETCA, can support Indigenous people's rights and culture, traditional knowledge, and cultural expression. And in particular, we'd also love to hear how you can see businesses helping or hindering Indigenous culture, traditional knowledge, and cultural expression. And if Dr. Joseph wants to jump in on this point too, you're completely welcome. It's a popular question. So so what I'll do maybe is turn first, given that Valerie's already started us off by explaining a little bit more about some of these incredible advantages and tax advantages as well. I'm going to turn first to Daphne, then Damien, then Valerie back again. And if anyone else would like to jump in, you absolutely can. So Daphne, what do you think? How is it possible for Indigenous international trade to support Indigenous people's rights and culture and traditional knowledge? And of course, how are businesses helping or hindering? Oh, and unmute. Hopefully unmuting.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Go. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Before that, I want to sing a little bit. It's the Taiwanese the Indigenous songs. Maybe you guys hear that before. Da, 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 da. It's related to Olympics. Okay. The 1996 Atlanta Olympic theme song, Enigma. Okay, from they have a song called Return to Innocence. Anybody ring a bell? Or are you guys too young to listen to it when you were a child? Oh, okay, Damien said, yeah. Da, 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 da. Okay, so yeah, the song was sang by Ami Zhu singer. Okay, and you guys know what happened for that song? The song singer sued for compensation because it was misused. For the Indigenous Ami Zhu, the Ami sings the songs, and it was result. They sued the Olympic Committee for compensation because that was misused in the songs and become Olympics theme song, and that result in a off the court settlement. So after the Olympic, awareness of Indigenous music rights was finally significantly raised. So Olympic Committee, they publicly acknowledged the Amis people of Taiwan as the song creator and announced the establishment of the Indigenous Intellectual Property Foundation to help preserve Indigenous culture and arts. Yeah, as the Olympics come in, so this is something I want to raise because the German band in Enigma unauthorized use Amis songs highlight the need to respect Indigenous intellectual property rights. So in 2015, the Taiwan government implemented pioneer legislation, the Traditional Indigenous Intellectual Creation Protection Act, to safeguard Indigenous traditional knowledge and the cultural expression from the commercial misuse. So that's why I want to mention that the Olympic one and try to show you my vocal. Yeah, but in 2020, actually, a Japanese brand, Kirin beer. You guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, this beer, right? They use the Japanese brand Kirin beer. They launch a product with indigenous design. Okay, they obtain tribal consent and paying loyalty for tribal development. And this mark Taiwan's first commercial licensing case for indigenous intellectual property. So that's why I'm talking about indigenous trade. The intellectual property was protected and regulated by government. And it is a good business practice, which the corporation can work with indigenous community for the cultural promotion, as well as promotion indigenous business as well. This is what I want to present.
Excellent answer, and very memorable as well for us. I've got to admit, I'm more knowledgeable about some of the Indigenous intellectual property and traditional knowledge, respect traditions, than I am about sports events. So it was easier to recognize your song when I understood the origins. But I know that most people are not as strange as I am, and so I really appreciate that example. I've got Wayne coming in hot pursuit to add something else, and then I'm going to turn to Damien to help us out with some answers. Go ahead, Wayne.
Thank you. I just want to echo Daphne's concern about Indigenous intellectual property, because we've had the same thing happen in Canada during the Vancouver Winter Olympics. The Olympic board decided to say, gee, let's do something Canadian where we can equip all our athletes with something that's kind of Indigenous. So they had the idea, gee, we'll engage the Cowichan people on Vancouver Island to make Cowichan sweaters with the Olympic logo on it. And won't it be great, because that'll be an Indigenous incorporation of the event. So negotiations were had, and a deal was almost ready to go. And then the large Hudson's Bay company basically poisoned the waters and said, gee, we could do that for half the cost and make it look twice as commercial. And so they came up with their own Hudson's Bay Cowichan sweater and basically scared off the Olympic Committee in closing the deal with the Cowichan people. The Cowichan people objected because, of course, there's Hudson's Bay basically taking the intellectual property of the Cowichan people and claiming that they're making a Cowichan sweater, but it's actually not a Cowichan sweater. It's actually a Hudson's Bay cheap knockoff. And the same sort of thing, the upshot of this was, well, there wasn't any clear, unfortunately in Canada, there's not a lot of clear intellectual property protection for Indigenous knowledge because of the laws that currently exist, the way it's backwards. I always say it's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. But an out-of-court settlement was reached where there was a settlement to share the proceeds of the Hudson's Bay Cowichan sweater in the end. But the long story short was there wasn't sufficient protection of Indigenous intellectual property. So I echo Daphne's concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And Damien, I'm assuming there are similar stories that you could share of ways that businesses are helping or hindering Indigenous culture, traditional knowledge, and cultural expression in your part of the world.
Yes, absolutely. It's a very common problem, unfortunately. The cultural appropriation of Indigenous intellectual property. Botanicals. It's the whole gamut. Our artwork, our technology in terms of the climate, the environment. The commodification of our ideas as well, just to lose its cultural importance and significance. Things that might sort of helping as well as from a business sense is, if it's approached appropriately, it still is within Indigenous ownership, management, control is, of that IP is the preservation of culture, the economic empowerment of the Indigenous people who are running the business as well. And I might, in terms of IPETCA itself, what some of the fundamental principles it's looking to protect is Indigenous rights and culture, traditional knowledge, cultural expression as well. And I might just quickly comment on just one of the pathways, pathway one of IPETCA, which is focusing on trade, environment, and sustainability. So one of the main objectives, that there's four four main objectives there, but one of them is to emphasise the role of the environment and sustainability in contributing to food and nutrition and security and resilience as well. Another one which is relevant, I think, in respect of this question is recognising Indigenous cultural knowledge and perspectives on preserving and maintaining the environment in the negotiation and implementation of trade agreements and some of the major projects which are taking place on Indigenous held lands as well. And also just in terms of one of the other objectives, it's expanding opportunities for environmentally sustainable Indigenous businesses and clean and renewable technologies. And I might just briefly comment here in respect of the Australian market. As we all know, there's a lot of mining, energy and resources work which has taken place over the last few decades, but there's this huge wave now of renewable energy projects which are being rolled out across our nation. And a lot of the Indigenous groups are seeing this as an opportunity to potentially reset or refresh the approach in negotiating with these proponents of these renewable industries. And so one way that I think IPETCA can support is an exchange of knowledge in how to properly recognise, engage with the Indigenous groups and ensuring that the agreements, the deals which are cut with the Indigenous groups are kind of meet a market kind of international standard, a best practice approach. And, you know, some of the participants on this panel come from jurisdictions which, from an Australian perspective, are kind of seen as a market leader in terms of cutting deals Indigenous peoples cutting deals with proponents on their land. So we would love to kind of review and you know, get a better understanding of where the market's at across the globe, and hope to roll that out at a domestic level as well with this new wave of renewables which is rolling out across our country. Thank you.
That's very exciting. I'm going to remind, I've received a few messages from people who are online here watching us and joining us from their different time zones today. I understand people online with us, but a few of you are classes who are watching us with an entire group on one registration. So if you would like to have discussions among yourselves with some of the points that are being raised, and then enter into the Q&A a few questions you'd like to ask us, we have one more sort of formal question for the entire panel. Happy to turn to the Q&A. So feel free to sort of introduce yourself on the Q&A. Tell us if you're here listening with us as an individual, or if there's an entire group with you, and type in your question. And Una's monitoring carefully and will help us to bring those forward, as will I. So I'm going to turn just briefly to Dr. Joseph in case he also would like to add anything on this question we've just been discussing of you know, the Indigenous rights and culture, traditional knowledge, cultural expression, and how business can help or hinder this, including under IPETCA. And then we're going to go to our last question.
Yeah, thank you. That's very clear. Yeah, it's same thing over in New Zealand too. You know, exploitation of Māori knowledge, Māori cultural expressions. I don't know if people are sports fans here, but for New Zealand, whenever our teams play, whether it's rugby or basketball, whatever, we usually do before our sports games, international games, what we call a haka, which is the war dance. And it's a traditional expression we used to do when we used to go to battle. We'd face off and do this war dance against each other, then go into battle, which is kind of like what sports games are. But it's starting to get quite popular around the world. A number of nations don't like it. Yeah, it's a matter of understanding the cultural context. It's actually an honor to have it done to you rather than intimidate you. It's an honor because they're thinking that you're worth it. You're worth it as a worthy foe. But anyway, there's been intellectual property issues around ownership of haka and similar Māori cultural expressions, and Māori traditional medicines too. It's another big one, like with other Indigenous cultures, you know, if they're traditional, we call it herbal medicines and practices. We have one we call Manuka honey, which it's a beautiful honey native to New Zealand, or the others are claiming they have it too, but it's quite an expensive honey for its medicinal purposes, not its taste. And overseas they sell it. It's so expensive, but you know, the IP, the intellectual property of protecting that name, Manuka honey, there's some disputes going on as we speak over who has the IP of that. And it's a traditional Māori expression. And so we have all these challenges. And also, like I'm sure the rest of you, with our traditional carvings and other things that tourists come and buy from our various countries, with respect, many of them are made in China. And they sort of, with respect, lose that authenticity of the cultural expressions. And some of our Māori corporates are producing these and are saying, hey, we want to have a trademark on there saying these are authentic, legitimate Māori products and services and knowledge too. And so we have similar challenges, and in our free trade agreements, we include things like geographic indicators, highlighting there's that geographic provenance of where our products come from. Also trying to sell that as a product in terms of it's, New Zealand made or Australian made, or this comes from these Māori tribes, it's made in this way, in terms of selling that as a promotion, with trade. So, those types of things. But a lot of our cultural expressions have been misappropriated. And so we're trying to protect them through our free trade agreements, through IPETCA, traditional economic, traditional knowledge, and so on and so forth. And yeah, trying to capture those in our free trade agreements, IPETCA, and allowing for our Māori businesses to actually engage, and our Māori corporates to engage in these processes too. Right. So yeah, quite the challenge, I think, for all of us. But trying to respond.
I will say, Dr. Joseph, I've seen some of the people who have had to negotiate with your team, who have come to see me here in Cambridge from London. I won't give details, but one of the things that they came to see me about was that they understood that they weren't going to get a trade agreement unless they included some of these protections that New Zealand and the Maori were asking for. And I found myself in this strange situation of sort of having to say, this isn't actually rocket science. You can agree. In the middle of the Fenland, sort of looking at them sideways. Very confused trade negotiators from among your partners who found themselves over a barrel and agreed, from what I hear. So
yeah, no, that's what we were thinking too. It's not rocket science. Yeah. It's just protect our interests, right? Protect our intellectual property, our cultural expressions.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see Wayne has another hot pursuit, so I'm going to let him jump in, and then we're going to turn to our last question before we look at what some of our colleagues have placed for us, some of our audience have placed for us and online. Wayne.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to give Val a chance to jump in there and brag a little bit about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act Amendment of 1990. But I'll be happy to steal her thunder if she doesn't want to comment, because we're talking about intellectual property and the protections. And the Indian Arts and Crafts Act is an old piece of legislation, but it was as old as 1935, and it was revised in 1990 to give it a lot more teeth to protect within the United States the marketing and representation of Indigenous arts and crafts and products. So it's illegal in the United States to display for sale or any part or product that's claiming to be Indigenous. And when they looked at the Indian Arts and Crafts Act and revised it in 1990, they upped the stakes to make it more relevant to the times, to make it more give it more bite and more punch. So, for example, for a first-time violation of the Act, you face a $250,000 fine or 5 years imprisonment or both. And if you're a business doing that, you could face the same civil penalties, and prosecution, but the fine is up to $1 million per offense. So there's a lot of bite behind that, and it's not perfect, but it's an effort to make it to protect Indigenous intellectual property. And I think the world needs to take a cup of knowledge from some of the great tools that are out there that are currently being used in the United States, like the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990. There we go. There's my plug.
Valerie, would you like to add a little bit about how you've seen it working? And don't feel you need to comment on whether if somebody else is convicted of a felony, they could also face $1 million fine and 40 years in jail, because I'm sure that's a question mark that lots of people are asking.
I think Wayne did it well, and I've never seen $1 million fine and 40 years in jail. But I guess if the crime was bad enough, that could happen. But thank you, Wayne, for jumping in.
All right, excellent. And are there other elements you'd like to add, Valerie, in terms of how international Indigenous trade supports Indigenous people's rights and culture, traditional knowledge, cultural expression, either from the sort of trade rules or from how businesses are helping or hindering? It's fine to say tax policy.
I guess I did. Since Wayne stole my part, I was kind of going to steal his a little bit. I think we're unique in North America, where we have Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And we all know that, the colonizers came in and gave us borders, and that we should be able to trade freely among ourselves. And so I do think that is kind of a traditional and cultural right we should have, to be able to trade with each other free of tariffs and the other things that happen when we trade across these imaginary borders now that someone other than us set up. So that was my version of Wayne's J Treaty plug right there. Sorry, Wayne. I did also want to say about the business structures. I do feel like that we have some cool things. Again, we don't, have IPETCA, but I want to talk just tiny briefly about ITIO's existence in the United States. So we have set ITIO up as a nonprofit 501c3 organization here in the United States. So that means there are tax benefits to joining, and we are set up for an educational purpose, which is to do international Indigenous economic trade education to get people more trade ready to trade with themselves or with each other, with other individuals across borders and things like that. So I think that's a great way to use businesses and business structures to further our goals that we have, whether through IPETCA or through the other avenues we have. So tiny plug for ITIO on the US side.
Oh, that's just excellent. That's definitely stealing Wayne's thunder. Well done. And actually, and you deserve it, Wayne. But actually also, of course, recognizing that there are principles even recognized in the US, MCA, that J Treaty is still there and is still governing these systems. I can see Damien has a hand up. I can also see that Una has a hand up, and I'm hoping that Una is going to be able to bring in a question we have just received from Naite Reis from Brazil. But Damien, of course, if you have something you were inspired to add from this, I'm very happy to turn to you and then to turn to Una to introduce the question.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep it relatively short. But just a comment around, the businesses, the Indigenous businesses in each participating economy, and the support is, at a very sort of base level, it's recognised by some of the participating economies that it's a question of actually identifying which Indigenous businesses are looking to trade internationally, right? And identifying those businesses, providing the support, getting them export, but identifying the ones that are actually export ready now, the ones that are in the pipeline to become export ready, and providing the support to get them to the point where they can trade, and then facilitating them in cutting those trade-related deals between participating economies, as well as broader APEC and across the globe, other WTO countries as well. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'm going to turn to Una, who can hopefully bring in the question from Brazil that has just arrived.
Hi, yes. I was sort of hesitating, but it's a good bridge between this question on cultural dimensions of Indigenous trade and also the next question you're going to get to, Marie-Claire. So it's from Nete Reis, excuse me if I mispronounced, who's saying that they're from Brazil. They're congratulating on excellent debate, and they wanted us to think about how universities and governments can help traditional communities that do not receive support from their countries to benefit and store fish. So it's about the artisanal fishing community and how they work, how they would like to work to cooperatively with anyone who will help them to under the principles of solidarity. And they think that it would help with decreasing the catch of fish, guarantee income for millions of families that live in a context of food insecurity, but who also have this artisanal fishery they want to explore. And Nete adds that the artisanal fisher persons are important guardians of the oceans, and that the artisanal knowledge needs to be included in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal 14. And how can we strengthen this interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary process? So I think there's a cultural dimension and also a stewardship, sustainability dimension worth discussing.
Absolutely. So who would like to take that starting point?
I'll take it.
Okay.
Okay, we've got Damon and Wayne willing to jump in. I'm going to let Wayne be brief and then Damien be longer. And
Okay.
Daphne would like to add something as well.
Very simple, the way I see it, in the sense that I don't know the size of the question, but I'd say baby steps, in the sense that economies of scale. If you are a small local fisher and you wish to get financing, or you wish to get greater markets, then form a collective with local fishermen and use that collective, use the numbers to negotiate better access, better contracts, and alliances with corporations that would want to be receptive to exercising a shared responsibility over the ocean, that's in tune with your collective values. If your belief in traditional fishing practices is responsible, sustainable, then as a collective, you have a larger voice to be able to negotiate, to get agreements and educate the fisher corporations that are interested in profit, but they will also perhaps need a little bit of education concerning traditional knowledge and how to respect local customs and traditions on sustainable development practices. There, short, sweet, to the point.
Excellent. And Damien, what would you like to add?
Oh, that's a great point, Wayne, and exactly where I was going in terms of the commercial aspect. If I just start, I can only comment in relation to Australia. I'm not familiar with Brazil or other parts of the globe, but look, there's a whole heap of legislation which cuts across and impedes the ability of Indigenous groups to be able to exercise their traditional rights in relation to hunting and fishing, etc. But Wayne, you're absolutely right to go towards the commercial aspect, in that if there is the ability to commercially work, identify other business partners to assert your legal rights in that space while still maintaining your traditional approach, sustainability, appropriate sustainability practices, and observing environmental needs. Those latter two aspects actually also commercially attract buyers as well. And so asserting those commercial rights can enable the group to, basically enforce its presence in its area and its lands and its traditional rights in relation to fishing. So absolutely the way to go. And it's often that a lot of the Indigenous related legislation in a domestic country kind of impedes, but some Indigenous groups haven't recognised yet that there's this whole other avenue that you can pursue and rely on kind of corporate related interests but approached in from an Indigenous perspective to assert yourself. Yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. I can see Dr. Joseph is in hot pursuit, so we're going to turn to him. And maybe, Dr. Joseph, you would like to answer this also in the context of our final question for the panel, which is, of course, how does international Indigenous trade, including under IPETCA, which the guest from quite ably anticipated for us, Naite Reyes. Thank you. That's an excellent question. So I'm going to turn to Dr. Joseph, and then I'll also turn back to Daphne and to Wayne to give us some comments on that one.
Yeah, thank you again, Mr. Marie-Claire. So for our person from Brazil, I was just going to say I fully support what my other two colleagues said. But I'd just like to add, in terms of building alliances, trying to get some NGOs to support you, and also the academies, university support, and trying to get them to come in and support you in terms of doing some research around, your cultural values, your cultural practices, and sustainability, what's happening to your fisheries resources at present. What are your traditional values and traditional practices for sustaining the fisheries, so on, and trying to get that empirical research out, as it were, to support your cause. And I know none of that's easy, but getting the universities to back you, and NGOs as well as corporates. Also, remembering too, this question of resources, of course, as Damien said, understanding what are your laws in your country, but also if these aren't supportive, then going outside of your country to, with IPETCA, with other, Indigenous alliances, and even the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, for example, and, human rights, and so on, utilizing those other avenues. But again, that depends on resources, but locally, at least trying to get the academies to come and support you too. And saying that too, just one challenge around that too, just beware of your intellectual property there too, and make sure that's protected for your group rather than the researchers. Yeah. They get that, but in that respect, getting them to support your cause. But coming back to the actual question, how does international Indigenous trade, including under IPETCA, support sustainable development and environmental stewardship? If I can just quickly mention here, for us as Māori, we have these customary practices and laws, call them tikanga, and now they're a source of law in New Zealand. Right? A lot of our tikangas recognized in our statutes, now in common law too. Our Supreme Court recently said it's the first law of this country, and it is a source of law. And all our law schools have to teach it in the core courses now. So it's quite a big development. But under our law, we have this concept called kaitiakitanga, or stewardship. Right? We are stewards of the environment, not owners of the environment. And so implicitly in our culture, explicitly, it's all about sustainable development, environmental stewardship. And when I teach this, I talk to a lot of our lawyers, students, so on, and I tell them our laws, basically based on what we call the 4 R's, right? We have a relationship with the environment, and as part of that relationship, we have the right to utilize the resource, right? To utilize the ocean, the forest, the land, fisheries, and so on. But we also have a responsibility to conserve those resources for future generations. And by virtue of that relationship, we must respect everything, right? So it's relationship, respect, rights, and responsibilities, not just rights. We often forget about our responsibilities. And those 4 R's brought together should be sustainable development and environmental stewardship. And I also just add this part too. We're all subject as Indigenous peoples to colonialism of the past, or some would say it continues today. And colonialism was about displacing Indigenous peoples from the sites of power. Land, law, economy, politics, language, health, housing, and so on and so forth. And we're recovering from that now. And through treaties, through IPETCA, through law, and so on, we're trying to regain some of those sites of power and get back into those sites of power. But unfortunately for all Indigenous peoples in all 5 countries, suspect I guess a legacy of colonialism is our peoples, Indigenous peoples, are in the negative social statistics of our societies. Poor health, poor housing, economic development, education, and so on. And so we're recovering from that. But as has been alluded to already, the world is in a mess environmentally, politically, and socially in many areas. And I believe that the world needs Indigenous solutions. They need Indigenous knowledge. They need Indigenous values, Indigenous practices to recover from these problems and challenges we are experiencing globally. And IPETCA and our free trade agreements that include our Indigenous chapters give us that opportunity to share this with them and to help them understand just how effective our knowledge, our laws, our systems really are. And they need to adopt them too in their own different ways, but with those principles of sustainable development, environmental stewardship. And that's what we're trying to do. And for Māori, we have over 10,000 Māori corporate entities. Many of them are engaging in international trade. They're ready. It's mainly primary sector, forestry, fisheries, farming, fruit and veggies, but also some tertiary and some manufacturing in other areas. And so they're engaging a lot of that, and that's the significance of our free trade agreements and IPETCA. And it's about lifting us from these negative social statistics and so on through sustainable development. Sorry to go on a bit. Just one last thing I'll say is I've written about this book we published last year about a caution when we're getting into our development, economic development, and so on for Indigenous peoples. I call it, my philosophical approach, the 4 T's. With our development, it's about traditional. We need to incorporate our culture, very strong, that guides us in a contemporary form. We need to focus on, as Indigenous peoples, I think, transcendental development, transcendental governance, that spirituality and that underpins our culture and our relationship to the land, and everything's connected. So it's traditional, transcendental, it's transactional. We've got to get business done. We've got to get economic development and make our billions and millions and so on, but not at the expense of our culture, our well-being, and our environment. And so the 4th T I maintain, and I'll finish here, is it should be transformational too. Right? Transformational, of lifting our people out of these negative social statistic areas we're confined in, lifting them above that, but enhancing it through our culture and so on. And at the same time, transforming our nation, state, and community in the process. And so that's all I'll add about sustainable development and environmental stewardship. There's a lot to learn from Indigenous people's knowledge, law, worldviews, and culture.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's a great deal to be able to add and to very seriously answer this question in front of us. I'm going to turn to Daphne if there's also a little you would like to add about how to support sustainable development and environmental stewardship.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so for Taiwan, there's some eco-lodge projects. They use sustainable material like energy efficient design within the indigenous tribes. And also in terms of biodiversity conservation, collaborating with treaties like Convention on Biodiversity to protect indigenous lands and ensure that ecotourism activity contribute to conservation efforts. For example, they promote wildlife conservation project led by indigenous community and integrating this into tourism experiences. And there's a significant example in Pingdong County, Wutai Township. In 2020, Wutai Township became the first indigenous area designated as a natural and cultural ecological landscape zone. And the local tour guide was trained, the professional tour guide was trained from the Wutai tribes that try to be local cultural and history tour guide. So they provide ecological, environmental mentoring and encourage tribal youth to engage as tour guides. So those are create jobs for local community, enhance environmental protection, and promote cultural heritage. And they also create partnership from tourism industry. The tourism industry in Taiwan are very supportive. There's a very significant example from major company like Lion Travel. They incorporate 2 days tribal tours as part of their 7 days group tour in Taiwan. So whenever there's an inbound tour, they always have the foreign tourists always have opportunity to enjoy the tribal ecotourism. So this is something I think IPETCA can also kind of promote toward this ecotourism between countries and global tourism industry.
Excellent. Thank you, Daphne. I wonder if you just want to come in with one closing idea, Wayne. And I know that we might want each other person to also say if they have one last closing thought before we conclude. Again, if anyone who has joined us online, either as a group or as an individual on the connection, put your questions in the Q&A. Wayne.
Yeah, my closing comment is 3 points, and those are the hope of IPETCA. And they're found in 3A, B, and D. And I want to read them to you. For example, 3A, the participating economies recognize that existing international human rights obligations are interrelated, interdependent, and mutually reinforcing, and should be considered alongside each other when advancing the rights of Indigenous people in their participation in international trade. Think about that. 2, the participating economies reaffirm their existing support for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, which plays a huge part when you can read it into the spirit and intent of how this trade agreement is supposed to move forward. And finally, 3D, participating economies acknowledge the importance of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing for Development, given their relevance to Indigenous peoples, including how they relate to protection of lands, waters, and natural resources, and how they support the conditions for sustainable and inclusive economic development. Those 3 concepts in 3A, B, and D, in my opinion, are the real core of what IPETCA, how IPETCA should be approached with respect to the spirit and intent. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'll also just answer live the question that came up on the Q&A that yes, we will be sharing the recording to everyone who has registered, whether they were able to join us online tonight or they're waiting for the record to come through in order to watch it on their time zone. Speaking as someone to whom it's nearly 2 a.m. now, I can certainly sympathize with those people. I wonder, are there any final closing remarks that each of our panelists would like to give, or can I turn back to Una? Excellent. So thank you very, very much. It's been a very rich discussion, and I'm going to turn to Una to close for us and maybe to also call on Daphne. Una?
Sure. Daphne, did you want to say something?
Are we allowed to talk about our final remarks?
Sure.
If you, yeah, okay. That was what I was just asking for.
Yes, thank
Anyone
you.
has closing remarks, or if we wanted to.
Yeah,
wrap up.
I think it's a wonderful session today, but I think, the partnership are very important. Like we need to make friends and bring cooperation partners, very crucial for the next steps. So I know the government already provide a lot of procurement opportunities to the indigenous business, but I think cooperation are not done enough. So we need to have more corporate partners for this inclusive supply chain. And there's a supply diversity program in the world, but I think more indigenous trade, indigenous business should be more included, into this mix. So this way, indigenous business can be sustained and continue to grow. This is my suggestion for the IPETCA to discuss further.
Excellent, thank you. Would Dr. Joseph, would you also like to just give a little brief concluding?
No, I go on too much, but yeah, I fully agree. My concluding point, I guess, is IPETCA is very, very important for us. And I think for all of our countries that have signed up to IPETCA, again, it's a good start. It's taking it further from here. But I think, as Daphne said, what's key is partnerships or relationships. Those relationships, again, having good, frank relationships, being at the tables of power where we can talk and share and make agreements going forward on how we're going to implement this, where we have challenges, differences of opinion too, how we can resolve that. But it's those relationships that are key. And I'll just finish with this point for Māori. In New Zealand, we have a growing Māori economy that's currently up to 70 billion, and it's contributing over 8% to GDP. And a lot of that is from our Māori corporates engaging in international trade. Not all of it, and it's it's quite and Māori control 50% of commercial fisheries in the country now, 40% of forestry, 10% of dairy, 30% of sheep and beef, 30% of lamb production, 10% of kiwi fruit. So starting to overcome those colonial legacies, as it were, and become these sites of power in these spaces, and starting to engage a lot more in international trade, and IPETCA is assisting with that as our free trade agreements and other agreements we're entering into, and it needs to be inclusive and relational. That's the key.
Yep.
Thank you, and thank you for being part of this panel. I've enjoyed it, and for ILAC bringing us together, and Wayne and Damien and Daphne, great to meet you all, and everyone who's watching this. Thank you. Kia ora mai tātou.
I'm going to turn to Damien now, the other down under. If you had just a couple of things.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick one. So, look, from my perspective, look, it's looking very positive with our IPETCA. Governance framework is created. We've got the terms of reference, and we're presently finalising the work plan. US has joined on an observership status. At the end of this year, there'll be an informal caucus held during the APEC meetings in Peru. There is interest from other world economies to potentially participate as an observer status as well. And we are hopeful to have those observers who do join to, shortly thereafter convert to full membership as well. So it's looking positive, and, there's a lot of keen participants in IPETCA who are looking to make sure that there are real deliverables, provided through this mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie, would you like to add anything else, or shall I turn to Una?
I defer to Una.
Una.
Okay. Well, this has just been such a rich discussion. I really appreciate the wonderful conversations we've had tonight. And on behalf of everyone who's been on this webinar, I'd like to thank the excellent speakers, Wayne, Damien, Valerie, Daphne, and Robert, and our excellent moderator, Mary Claire, for providing so much useful information today. you were not shy in talking about the problems that are being faced and the challenges, but you also really portrayed a hopeful and visionary future with international Indigenous trade and the relationships between Indigenous communities around the world. So that was really exciting. I thank the audience for your attention and your probing questions. And as Marie-Claire said, we will be continuing the conversation by sharing the video in the coming days. So watch for that on our website and social media. So finally, please follow both the International Law Association of Canada and the International Law Association, the mother organization, on our respective websites and social media to see what new events are coming up. You're also most welcome to join the exciting and supportive international law community at ILA-Canada. And please note that we provide free membership for students. So with that, I wish you all a very good morning for those of you who are just waking up and having your coffee, a good day to those who've had it, good evening to those in my time zone, and to those like Marie-Claire who are way into the night, good night to you. And thank you so much again for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.